with the report. Well, very good afternoon, everyone, or indeed good morning to some of you who are in a very different time zone to us. This is a rather special occasion for us here at Newcastle, because we don't just get to run a book launch as part of our seminar series. We also get to launch a book by a former colleague and a very good friend, Livia Capponi's Cleopatra, recently published in the Storia and Società series by Laterza. Livia is now associate professor at the University of Pavia, but as many of you will know, she used to teach here at Newcastle, and she's kept very close ties with many of us over the years. And it's a great pleasure to have her back, if virtually, and to get the chance to discuss a very important book, a very important piece of work that is both very original in a number of respects, and at the same time very much in keeping with long-standing research interests of Livia's that she has been pursuing over the years, and that indeed also informed her teaching in her Newcastle years. So it's a delight to have a chance to welcome her back today, if virtually, and to discuss her book and indeed her own idea of Cleopatra, her own version of Cleopatra, in a very distinguished company. We have assembled, we have gathered a panel this afternoon that is intended to really bring to the fore the richness of Livia's work by drawing on various sets of specialism and expertise. And it's also a Newcastle, a panel that, in a way, stresses and deepens Livia's connection with Newcastle. We have a distinguished outside panelist, Professor Peter van Minnen. It's a delight for us to be able to welcome him today, Professor of Classics at the University of Cincinnati, and indeed one of the most distinguished papyrologists currently active, whose name, whose reputation as a scholar is, I suppose, inextricably linked with Cleopatra, with the Cleopatra papyrus, and with that discovery early in the 2000s of Cleopatra's signature on the Cleopatra papyrus. We're especially grateful that he has agreed to discuss Cleopatra today with us, having no doubt discussed Cleopatra in many fora, in many venues over the years. I'm also delighted to have the chance to introduce as our panelists today two Newcastle colleagues. Dr. Joe Holton, who specializes in Hellenistic history, has a very strong interest in Hellenistic kingship or kingships in the plural, and is also director of education at the School of History, Classics and Archaeology. And Dr. Micaela Langellotti, who also teaches ancient history here at Newcastle, and who specializes in the economic and social history of Roman Egypt. Her recent OUP monograph on Teptunis has already made quite an impact in the field. And she has indeed a very distinguished body of work on Roman Egypt. So as you can see, there are different sets of interests through which we will be approaching Cleopatra through the prism of Livia's book. The plan today is to have three presentations from our three panelists. First John Holton, then Micaela Langellotti, and then Peter van Minnen. Livia will then be offering some thoughts, some responses, some musings on the issues that will have been raised by our panelists, and we will then open the question, the floor, for the floor rather, to questions and comments from the audience. So, well, this is the plan, and off we go. John, over to you.
Thanks, Federico. Sorry for coming in slightly late. I'm very happy to sort of be here chatting about Livia's book, Cleopatra, which has been wonderful. It's been a great read. I've learned a lot from it, profited a lot from it. I've got a few things to say, which I'm keeping fairly loose and informal, which I think is the convention of the genre. Talk about what I took away from the book, and discussion of a couple of interesting, detailed couple of interesting episodes. Yeah, thank you very much, Livia, for writing such an interesting book and sending it on, and thanks to Federico for organising and facilitating this whole thing. I think it's really great to have a session, and it's nice that there's such sort of diversity among the panel members here. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So I suppose I'll start by saying that, you know, in my humble opinion, I think this book is very rich, very full, but also extremely wide-ranging. And to me, it shows a very distinctive balance of perspectives. Speaking as Federico said, a historian of the Hellenistic royal dynasties, particularly in the earlier period, that's my background, and it's difficult to avoid looking at matters through that perspective. It's nice to see the Hellenistic aspects and the background of Cleopatra's life, career, and times well represented, and indeed the Egyptian basis of her rule, alongside her important role in the determination of high-level Roman politics that usually gets all of the attention. I think it's really important to see Cleopatra in terms of Hellenistic royal practice, particularly that of the sort of very singular Ptolemaic dynasty, and indeed to see her in terms of Hellenistic queenship, the long tradition of that. So in addition, quite aside from being fascinating as a historical person in her own right, which is really well evoked in the book, though avoiding some of the sensationalism that's often attached to her, Cleopatra is, I think, a brilliant lens for observing the wider processes at work in the 1st century BC Mediterranean and Near East. And I think the book does a really excellent job of evoking Cleopatra's influence in that context and of her attempts to shape the world around her. It's nice to see some agency emphasized here where it's appropriate. It's also nice to see a historical and contextualized Cleopatra, as much as a historical Cleopatra is at all recoverable. You know, it's impossible to be 100% objective. And not just a portrait that's primarily guided and informed by the preconceptions of the modern era. So there's no sort of vampy, transgressive, Hollywood-esque Cleopatra here. But at the same time, what I liked about the book is it's not a sanitized, rehabilitated Cleopatra that ignores the historical reality in an attempt to be revisionist. In fact, I thought that the book sort of handled the issue of Cleopatra's memory sort of really quite sensitively, including the issue of divergences and agendas in the sources, especially in that really interesting final chapter, La Memoria Bipolare. Livia points to the fact that many of Cleopatra's practices that were publicly censured by the Romans were in fact also practiced by the Romans, perhaps even to a greater degree than Cleopatra herself did practice them. And the broader monarchic model that was being critiqued in, say, Augustan propaganda served in turn as a model for emperors in the Roman world, not least by means of dialogue with Eastern provinces from Antony and Octavian onwards. And in some ways, I think what's interesting about Cleopatra is she's the most recent memory of Hellenistic imperial discourse in those last days of the Roman Republic. So she's important in providing a transition between a Hellenistic ruled world and a Roman imperial ruled one. And Livia points out especially that while the majority of ancient historiography passes through the filter of Augustan sort of authorized narratives, if you want to put it that way, to create a negative, somewhat caricatured literary portrait of the queen. Nonetheless, we can see, for instance, in Plutarch, different perspectives on Cleopatra that emphasize her cleverness, her love of family, her patriotism, if that's the right word, her sense of belonging and pride in Egypt, and her struggle to ensure a place in the world for her children, even in the midst of that world collapsing around her. And that is reconstructable, even though, as Livia nicely notes, Plutarch's account of Cleopatra somewhat takes the form of a soap opera, and I think that's quite a nice modern way of thinking about the kind of tragedy-informed biography that Plutarch writes. It is very much a kind of soap opera deliberately. Overall, I think the trade-off of this kind of study, giving back the so-called uniqueness or exceptionality of Cleopatra in return for getting a more nuanced understanding of the reality and a deeper placement in context and a more balanced view of sources, that's a trade-off that's well worth making. And to me, it's extremely productive, not to mention useful for a wide range of readerships that are coming from different backgrounds. So I think that the book, quite apart from everything else, provides a really valuable service in that respect. As I said, I'd like to focus on a couple of sort of nuggets, if I may, that seem particularly interesting to me. These are inevitably selected from my wheelhouse of Hellenistic history, and particularly Hellenistic royal politics and display. I hope this is okay, and I'll look forward very much to the other discussions too, which I'm sure will be far more embracive of the other important aspects of the subject. I found the discussion in the book about the diadem at the Lupercalia very interesting. So for everybody else, that's the event in February of 44 BC, at which Mark Antony repeatedly tried to get Caesar to accept a diadem nestled within a laurel wreath. This is an episode that I myself have been intrigued by for a while, not least because of that terminology of diadema, which is in our sources, that's shared in our Greek and our Latin sources for the episode. It's not simply corona or stephane or whatever, as Livia rightly says. It must mean the band of cloth that we know of as a symbol of Hellenistic royalty. I find that interesting because the discussion in the sources, and most scholarship, as far as I can tell, though it's not exactly my period of expertise, suggests that the issue at stake is in fact Roman regnum, not Hellenistic basileia. So in a way, there's a disconnect between the symbol and what is signified. And in that respect, I thought it really useful that the book connects this episode with Cleopatra, her absent presence, as it were, and with those rumors about Caesar moving his center of power to Alexandria or perhaps even to Ilium. And so in other words, connected to the Hellenistic influence on his ideology and on public perceptions of him. And I wonder indeed if in this scene we're seeing the totalizing power of the diadem to signify royal status. In its early Hellenistic context, it's something of an invented tradition in that it's invented to be utilized in contexts of accession and succession. It signifies and visually demarcates a new basilus or basilissa, as the case may be. And it's used this way for centuries, and so it becomes deeply embedded as a symbol of royal status in the round. And now when we see it in Rome, at the Lupercalia of 44 BC, it's interpreted in terms of the monarchic history of the operating culture. In other words, it's understood as symbolizing Roman regnum, and so as part of Caesar's quest, real or suspected, to revive the hated Roman kingship. So we see this as a kind of Hellenistic influence in operation, but Hellenistic royal ideology and symbolism had become so successful in defining the discourse of kingship at an international level that they could be detached from their original context. And so here it's the mechanics and use of the symbolism in the receiving culture to actually condition its meaning more than original context, which is really interesting when, again, thinking about the transitions between a Hellenistic world and a Roman imperial one. Two more very brief things I could say about the diadem at the Lupercalia. One is that the dynamics are interesting. Antony as the active bestower of the diadem, Caesar cast as the sort of passive recipient. If this were a Hellenistic staging of succession, this might actually mean Caesar is being invested as the new king, and that Antony has the power and agency to so invest. And maybe it means something that Antony is in fact consul at this point. And second is, I wonder if Caesar is in fact involved in this. Cicero demands of Antony in his second Philippic, as Livia writes in the book, where did you get the diadem from? Well, maybe this is a trial, an experiment to gauge the reaction of the Roman people to the symbol and to the status that it symbolized. And I can't help but note that Plutarch's account calls this a peira, so an attempt, but conceivably at a slight push, an experiment, a trial. Although I do like the idea, as Livia suggests, that this might be simply a gaffe on the part of Antony, which is certainly conceivable, or as a failed understanding of Caesar's wishes, or even an attempt to undermine them. The other nuggets I've sort of picked out similarly relate to Hellenistic royal ideology and imagery. One of the things I find most striking about Cleopatra is the emphasis on renovation and restoration in her reign, particularly in her relations with Mark Antony, and the attempt to reinscribe almost the blueprint of the Ptolemaic overseas empire. The infamous donations of Antioch and Alexandria in 37 and 34 BC is a high watermark of this. And as Rolf Strootman, for instance, has shown, these can be illuminated in the context of Hellenistic royal ideology and connected with Cleopatra's unique role as heir to the Ptolemies, but simultaneously heir to the now defunct Seleucid royal house. So in other words, connected to the use of her and her family as tools by Antony and Octavian, and then Antony alone, to control the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, which is by then habituated to royal rule with a network of family-related client kingships. Equally, though, there seems to be a lot of Cleopatra's own agency in attempts to resurrect Ptolemaic imperial power, not least in her own self-modeling on powerful Ptolemaic queens of the past, such as Arsinoe II Philadelphus, Cleopatra Thea, and indeed the gamut of divine equations that came along with these models, most prominently Aphrodite or Venus, if you like. And the book covers all this really persuasively, I think. I'm thinking also of one of my favorite episodes of Cleopatra's self-fashioning and clever interaction with external powers, and that's her meeting with Antony in Cilicia, in Tarsus, where she seems explicitly to invite the parallelism of Aphrodite and Dionysus for the encounter of herself and Antony. And I think Livia is absolutely right when she notes that this is not an exceptional, exotic form of guile from a seductress, which I think is largely the sense that sources want you to think, but a precise, meaningful political choice that's really heavily grounded in Ptolemaic precedent, not least in the examples of Arsinoe II and Cleopatra Thea. I think Cleopatra here, she's also inviting Antony to step into a traditional model, and so she's trying to control the interaction and the relative standing in the relationship. And in a way, it puts me in mind of the civic practice of ruler cult in the Hellenistic East too, which gradually comes to be extended to powerful Romans from Flamininus onwards. In that example, on one important model of interpretation, this is the cities exercising their will and their agency to obtain a favorable position with a powerful external figure. But it's also a means of coming to terms with what that power represents. Offering honors of cult is, in a way, a cognitive exercise, a working through of what that person means to the city and how they can be accommodated in terms of its history. So taking this insight back to Cleopatra, we might imagine something similar, inviting the equation with a divine couple, not just to bind Antony to her and achieve parity of standing, but also to achieve favorable position, benefaction, protection in the future. And it's also evidence of a cognitive system in a way too, in that it represents what Antony's power means and how it can be accommodated in terms of the history of the party involved. In this case, in the context of Hellenistic and particularly Ptolemaic royal discourse. Quite apart from this, what I love about that meeting of Antony and Cleopatra and Cilicia is the wide disparity in the knowledge and deployment of ceremonial, and in the deployment of conspicuous display of luxury and wealth, in other words, of royal truth. She overawes Antony with her gilded barge, her purple sails, her vast entourage, her spectacular banquets. And when he tries to compete in this game too, by inviting her to a spectacular banquet of his own, he clearly falls short of what is her well-established dynastic practice. He tries to engage her on her own terms, Hellenistic royal display, and of course is not successful. So I would say that these kinds of dynamics also show her strategic negotiation of difficult political waters, but also they're part of that attempt at renovation of Ptolemaic imperial power using the tools at hand. So as I said, just a few things that I can say really in response to a really stimulating study. I'll repeat that I think it's really well balanced. It's extremely detailed and comprehensive in its source work, and that's definitely one thing that I got from it. I've learned a lot from it, and I'll continue to profit from it as I use it in the future. I think at this point I'll hand over to one of my fellow panel members, but I'd like to say thank you again, Livia, for a brilliant study and making that available to us. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Without further ado, over to Micaela.
Thank you very much, Federico. Like John already said, thank you, Livia, for sending over such a beautiful book. I really enjoyed reading it. So I'm delighted to be part of the discussion on Cleopatra, not only because it gives me and us the opportunity to explore and revisit a number of key questions, not only on the place of Cleopatra in the power structures of the Mediterranean, in a period of great change, a period which will lead to the end of the Ptolemaic rule in Egypt and the establishment of the Principate in Rome, because John already mentioned a number of other issues that can be discussed, so like kingships and Hellenistic traditions. But I'm especially happy to be part of this panel of the discussion because I very much enjoyed reading the book, and which made me reflect on a series of points about the common scholarly approaches to the historical contextualization of powerful women in the past, but not only, because this is a model that can be applied to the study of women in general. So what I'll do in the next few minutes, trying to keep into good timing, is to summarize some of the aspects of the book which mostly caught my attention. I could talk forever because I made so many notes. There were just very many interesting parts. I really enjoyed reading that. So I'll do this because these aspects made me think more deeply about the broader implications of the ways Cleopatra was represented in the ancient sources. And also because these aspects made me aware of potential new angles of investigation for the future as well. So it was very stimulating reading. So I also have some few questions in the middle of my presentation. I have many questions, but obviously I'll keep it to just a few. So one of the most, if not the most apparent feature of the book has to be a combination of readability and precision in close textual analysis, a combination of which is not often found in historical works. So there are, of course, there's always an attempt to make history more accessible, but this book really is brilliant in this respect. It's very accessible, but very precise and detailed in analyzing the sources. So anyone when reading the book will notice that it's written in a very beautiful and engaging prose, very accessible. And this accessibility is a very important feature, is never lost, not even when, not even in those sections which are very detailed, and there is a close and a detailed investigation of the sources. So the way the history of Cleopatra has been put together with a focus of recontextualizing the sources and deconstructing some very well-established biases makes this book a great model for how history can be written to reach larger audiences. And that, again, it's not something to be underestimated anyway. And this brings me to ask Livia the first question, which is for later, so a very easy question, that is whether there is any plan to translate the book in English or other languages, because I'm asking this question, obviously, I'm happy with Italian now, it's fine, obviously, but just because, just to make it available, even in Arabic, I don't know, there have been projects, very recent, you know, to make, you know, books on Egypt in other languages, more, you know, to make them more accessible, because the way this book recontextualizes Cleopatra's life and place in history is not only an approach that needs to become more common and well known, and we can call it a post-colonial approach, but it's just, you know, might be also reductive saying that, but also because it's a starting point for renewed discussions on the role of women and on those die-hard biases of certain sources that we try to always overcome them, but they're always there. And, you know, it's very easy in the teaching when we teach even always talk about, you know, some of those gossips in Plutarch, Cassius Dio. And also because this book gives voice to certain groups of people that are normally ignored. We have this such breadth of sources used in the book, but I'll get to this point in a minute. So first question would be, any plan for translating the book? Now, the combination of readability and precision of source material brings me to another aspect of the book that I really would like to highlight, that is the way in which the ancient sources are recontextualized. I know that Livia, you know, summarizes very well the meaning of the significance of this recontextualization in the conclusions. But when reading the book is very easy to understand that the sources, there is more to just reading the sources. That is just the historical, not only recontextualizations, but awareness of other traditions that have to be taken into account. But I'll make some examples to be more precise. So this approach is done by combining an exceptionally wide range of evidence, which is really exceptional, including literary sources, papyri, inscriptions, stelae, and so on. And relevant information from each piece of evidence is then placed within this factual framework, which shows the frequent biases, inconsistencies, fictionalized anecdotes surrounding Cleopatra's life. And I have to say that although there are obviously many studies on Cleopatra that adopt a similar approach towards the evidence with the same aim of unmasking biases, Livia's book goes a step further, not only for the breadth of the evidence, which is taken into account, there is also mention of Arabic sources, but especially for the fact that the focus is not always and exclusively on Cleopatra. This recontextualization of the evidence relates to all the people that surrounded Cleopatra, so included obviously the Caesar, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, but also King Herod, and even other women. And at the point of women, I'll make it in a minute, possibly Livia and Octavia, the other Livia, Augustus' wife. So we also find recontextualization of key facts, and again, that don't affect affected only Cleopatra. Obviously, very important and interesting description, analysis of the on the exact year of Caesarean's birth, for example, which I found fascinating and very important from a historical point of view, the Alexandrian War and Egypt's relationship with Judea and King Herod. So this is not just about Cleopatra, and a recontextualization of the traditions and customs which emerge from people's behavior. So we can just say, obviously, Hellenistic traditions, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, but we can also make this distinction between the East and West, because that's probably a most visible distinction that we can find. And this broader recontextualization of the actual reasons that were behind personal relationships and of the traditions behind political choices allows us to rethink the whole history of the period. So, for example, various decisions made at different times by both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony do not appear as determined by blind passion, but they were rather well thought out political choices. This Julius Caesar and Mark Antony are no longer in Livia's reconstruction, puppets in the hands, of a seductive and exotic queen, but politicians who acted for the Rome benefit. So that the selfishness appears much more prominent, and they acted also within a well-established traditions. They were not, for example, we see it in the case of the assignment of some Roman territories to Cleopatra by Mark Antony in 37 BC, which is often regarded as motivated by Antony's love for Cleopatra. But in fact, this, as Livia well put it, can be better interpreted as an informed territorial reorganization, which falls legitimately within the remit of a Roman magistrate. So this is something that we never really stress enough. And same happened in 34 BC when Antony celebrated a triumph in Alexandria after a successful campaign very quick in Armenia, a triumph which was seen as illegal, but that fits well with the Hellenistic royal ideology, which was covered very well by John before me. And so, but it also fits, this triumph and the usual, the territorial reorganization also fits with Roman tradition that happens, giving territories to clients, kings. So, well, we can mention also the fact that Mark Antony had other lovers at the same time as Cleopatra, like notably Glaphyra, a detail that is mostly ignored, I find, in historical accounts. And well, I think I'm very conscious of time, so I just want to make the point about, I have other examples, but I'll stop and I'll move on to another point that I would like to make, which I find fascinating and very important, is on women. So an aspect of the book that intrigued me particularly is the role of other contemporary women like Octavia, Livia, Salome, a role that is revisited, and also not just the role of these women, but the relationships that were in place between these women, which I found very interesting. And I think there is scope for quite a bit of research, although, as Livia noted, there has been some recent important scholarship on it. But this is important because it really normalizes the role of Cleopatra, and that is one of the aims of the book, as Livia noted. So it makes the Cleopatra less special in a way. So she was not unique. Rather, her actions and her behaviors are fitted within a more general set of traditions that we find replicated by other powerful women of the time. So on the one hand, this reveals a clear connection between Eastern and Western traditions and the desire of Roman women to emulate, to some extent, Eastern forms of behaviors. And interestingly, even the potential interactions between Cleopatra on the one hand and Octavia and Livia on the other hand are not set in a framework of contrast and rivalry, which I find very important to note, because we always hear there's always this narrative and fictionalized history in a way where like women hated each other. So I did find this and the whole reconstruction is very convincing as well. So this is another question I would like to ask Livia, that is, how likely, I know that you do suggest that there was obviously, that there might have been a context between Livia and Cleopatra. It's not, we cannot know 100%, but obviously if some kind of link or relationship existed between the two women, or even between Cleopatra and Octavia, but let's say Livia. So what would this tell us about the role of Livia and other powerful women of the time? I think there are broader implications. So it's not just about, would they, how they influence political power and their husbands, because that's independent from their husbands. And I'm asking this question because it seems to me there is much more to say about the women's involvement in foreign affairs, and also the liaising with other women, which is quite, a point in case. Very last point, again, another question which I found interesting is about, at some point, there is a discussion on, obviously the reliability of all the sources, and Plutarch that says that Cleopatra knew so many languages, but Livia makes a very important point that Cleopatra, she's obviously said to know so many languages, and she could communicate with all the people in the East. But the ability to communicate in different languages was in fact a cliche, also attributed to Mithridates, king of Pontus. So it is possible somehow that Cleopatra didn't necessarily know so many languages, but she just communicated with those people in Aramaic. So then, of course, if that's true, that will further reduce Cleopatra's exceptionality. So just I'll finish with this question. So if you do believe, do we need to believe, obviously, again, that's probably very, the question, I don't know whether that can be answered, but on the basis of, of all your studies, whether you think that how likely is it that Cleopatra actually knew all these languages, or whether, that's another way to just make her a bit more exotic? And again, just more out of curiosity, I have to say. I do have much more to say, but I'll stop here because I realize I've been talking for too long. But again, Livia, thank you so much for writing such a beautiful book. Wonderful. I learned so much. And then also the reason I'm selfishly, I asked about a translation because I want to give this book to my students to read because it's fantastic. Okay, thank you. So I'll
Thanks very much, Micaela. Yes, Livia, as you can see, plenty of praise, but our panelists are also sort of putting you to work with a number of queries that no doubt you'll follow up later. I'm handing over to Peter van Minnen.
Yes, I'm also happy to participate, quite honored. You there in Newcastle must have a weak spot for Southwest Ohio, inviting me after Denise McCoskey earlier. Her institution, Miami University, is not actually in Florida, but down the road here from Cincinnati. Okay, I plead guilty. About 20 years ago, I identified a papyrus in Berlin, known as Pibingen 45, or the Cleopatra papyrus, as the latest dated decree of Cleopatra. For a brief while in the winter of 2000, 2001, I was the world's most famous or infamous classicist. I committed my crime of giving the public what it wanted. Today, the world's most famous classicist is Dirk Obink, another papyrologist. He also gave them what they wanted for a price. That is why I am still available to address you today. Livia Capponi has just published a new biography of Cleopatra, and it is one of the best, and I have read a lot of these. Earlier in 2005, she published a book about Augustan Egypt. Both books focus on a time period that is exceptionally important for historians. Karl Jaspers spoke of axial ages, and that is what we have here. From the reign of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, to that of Nero, Egypt and the Mediterranean world at large underwent profound changes that have kept us historians busy, especially since the trickle of papyrus documents from Egypt became a flood toward the end of the 19th century. Augustus and his immediate successors introduced new ways of governing Egypt, while at the same time preserving the best practices of the Ptolemies, or at least grandfathering them out. Unfortunately, the 1st century BC, with the first half of the 1st century AD, is also the least well-documented period of the history of Greco-Roman Egypt. We are much better informed about the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and the papyrological documentation picks up steam after the middle of the 1st century AD. The situation is perhaps not as bad as all that, because for the reign of Cleopatra, we also have literary sources. And we do have the waste paper of an office in Alexandria from the reign of Augustus. These and other pockets of evidence made it possible for Livia to document the various chapters of her first book on Augustan Egypt. For her new book on Cleopatra, she uses some papyrological and epigraphical evidence, but it is not the book about Cleopatra's Egypt that I was hoping for. It is a biography of Cleopatra. It is certainly one of the better documented of existing biographies, and I learned a lot from it and hope to learn from it going forward. Ever since the winter of 2000-2001, I have been wondering about what a study of Cleopatra's Egypt would be like, one that would rely on the several hundred epigraphical and papyrological texts. There is a dissertation from 1980 that made a start with this by Linda Ricketts. She heavily relied on papyri from Heracleopolis, retrieved from cartonages, mummy casings in Berlin, and published in BGU 8. Since 1980, more papyri from Heracleopolis, from the 1st century BC, have been retrieved from other cartonages in Berlin and published in more volumes of BGU. Most of these date from the early years of Ptolemy XII or from the reign of Augustus, but some date from the last years of Ptolemy XII and the first years of Cleopatra. According to Wolfgang Müller in 1968, these texts, and I quote, paint a gloomy picture of unrest, distress, and oppression, end of quote. This assessment was called into question by Herwig Mehler in 1983. He stressed the prosperity of Egypt in the 1st century BC, citing examples from art and archaeology. Mehler also interpreted the papyrological documentation more convincingly. The petitions and reports that contain the negative statements highlighted by Müller are either concerned with local matters and should not be generalized, or cluster in a short period of time, that is the last years of Ptolemy XII and the first years of Cleopatra. I may add that the negative statements in these texts are often topoi that can also be found in texts from the 2nd century BC or the 1st century AD. But I tend to agree with Mehler that there is a brief period in the middle of the 1st century BC in which Egyptian authorities tried to collect texts more vigorously than ever before. Unless we are misled by the distribution of the evidence, we may conclude that after the reinstatement of Ptolemy XII in 55 BC and into the early years of Cleopatra, the Egyptian government was strapped for cash to pay off the creditors and keep in Rome and keep the troops of Gabinius happy. After 47 or so, things seem to get back to normal. Let us then review some of the papyrological and epigraphical evidence for Cleopatra's reign. After Ptolemy XIII was added as co-ruler, he preceded her in the official titulature from then on. Their first attested decree, or prostagma, dates from October 50 BC. It's preserved on papyrus and favors the corn supply of the population of Alexandria. The next one is, again, the same rulers from 49-48, preserved on papyrus, and confirms the validity of so-called pistes, letters of protection issued by government officials for, in this case, peasants. Such pistes often interfered with the best interests of the state, but in 49-48, the state was still too weak to enforce its will unfettered. Literary sources then claim that Ptolemy XIII had Pompey killed in 48. The troops of Caesar did him in 47, while the other sister, Arsinoe IV, paid the piper in the Roman triumph in 46. After 47, the other brother, Ptolemy XIV, as co-ruler alongside Cleopatra for a few years, may also have preceded her in the official titulature. They issue an act or decree in March 46, preserved on stone this time, in favor of the Temple of Isis in Ptolemais. Shortly after, they issued another act in June 46 about the illegal use of asylum. An act about goose herds, so you see that we are getting into some really important things. An act about goose herds, preserved on papyrus, follows that, but is undated. So is an inscription recording an act reaffirming the status of a Jewish synagogue somewhere in Egypt. It ends famously with the Latin regina et rex iuserunt, in that order. The rex may well have been Caesarion. Cleopatra always preceded her co-ruler Caesarion in the official titulature. Now, one of the unresolved issues is the date of Caesarion's birth. Traditionally, scholars have relied on Plutarch and an inscription from the Serapeum in Memphis to put the birth in 47. The inscription turns out to refer to Pharaoh Djoser, not to Ptolemy Caesar. The alternative has always been to put the birth in 44 BC. Cicero first mentioned Caesarion in a letter to Atticus from May of that year, apparently as a newly born infant. Cicero deplores a Tertulla who had a miscarriage, and then continues, I wish it were true for Cleopatra and especially that Caesar of hers. That is not very nice, but can hardly be a comment made 3 years after the fact. As Bernard Legras has observed, the date of celebration of Caesarion's Ephebeia in 31, according to Plutarch, also points to a date of birth in 44, because in Ptolemaic Alexandria, coming of age meant turning 14, or in our reckoning, 13. One could, of course, argue that Caesarion's Ephebeia could not be celebrated earlier because of the absence of his mother from Alexandria. Now, Livia puts the birth somewhat arbitrarily in 45. Caesarion must have been available in some form in the fall of 45 when Caesar drew up his will. After the assassination of Caesar, some people claimed that he had denied paternity in his will. I think this is fake news. These people may not have realized that the will was drawn up much earlier. The will may have failed to mention Caesarion, presumably because there was as yet no Caesarion in the fall of 45. Mark Antony later claimed that Caesar had acknowledged paternity, but that could be more fake news. Okay, back to our review. This will turn into a question for Livia later. Back to our review of the papyrological and epigraphical sources. The next act now of Cleopatra and Caesarion, preserved on stone, is from April 41 and favors Alexandrian landowners in the Egyptian Chora against local authorities. Incidentally, both the acts I earlier mentioned of March 46 and this one from April 41 are addressed to the same Theon, who was expected to transmit such acts to the proper authorities with a cover letter of his own. Who was this Theon? His title is not given in the Acts of March 46 or April 41. In a fragmentary decree of June 46, preserved on papyrus, Cleopatra mentions the official, and I quote, the official left behind in charge of official business and of the city, that is Alexandria. I suspect that this is none other than Theon, left behind by Cleopatra during an absence of hers from Alexandria. We know that she was in Rome in 46 and that she was abroad with Mark Antony in 41. Now, a successor of Theon is the addressee also of P. Bingen 45, an instruction similar to the Acts of March 46 and April 41, in which Cleopatra instructs this official who is replacing her in her absence to grant tax privileges to a Roman named Publius Canidius, the famous Bingen 45. We are dealing, according to me, with an original here. In the note at the top, the addressee acknowledges receipt. A copy sent to other officials would have been preceded by a cover letter, which is lacking here. And the subscription would be in the same hand as the rest of the text. Attention may also be drawn to the sloppy writing of the main text. It is not a chancery hand reserved for correspondence with the outside, because it was a piece of interdepartmental mail sent with the sort of diplomatic pouch from either Rome or some other place to Alexandria. The addressee's name, the official addressed in line 2, cannot be read as Theon, but must be a replacement. In March 33, Cleopatra was not in Egypt, but with Mark Antony somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, where she sent this instruction to her second in command or so left behind in Alexandria. Cleopatra had persuaded Mark Antony to let her stay. Plutarch says that she bribed Publius Canidius to support her against Mark Antony's reluctance to let her stay and against the advice of others. While I would not want to call the tax privileges listed in Bingen 45 an outright bribe, Cleopatra isn't actually giving him anything, one can imagine how Roman propaganda would have taken this as a smoking gun. What is essentially a series of tax incentives inviting Publius Canidius to invest in Egypt and to engage in import and export is a kind of reward for his services in the winter of 33. If my identification of the beneficiary in this text as the second man in Mark Antony's army is correct, we are not dealing with a large sellout of Egypt, because most Romans would never have been awarded such privileges. Livia, in her conclusion, speaks of a bipolar memory of Cleopatra. The good Cleopatra resonated with Zenobia and the Egyptian priests who continued her cult as late as 373. The bad Cleopatra resonated with almost everyone else. She was made to bear the brunt of Roman propaganda, which tended to spare Mark Antony. I think we can overcome the bad rep to some extent with the help of documents from her reign, such as the ones that I have reviewed here. After a few difficult years, as I pointed out at first, 55 to 47, Egypt regained its prosperity when it became Cleopatra's Egypt, in a literal sense of the word. So my questions to Livia are as follows. Can you conceive of a study of the inner workings of Cleopatra's Egypt along the lines of what I have just laid out, and perhaps modeled on your own Augustan Egypt, contrasting what we find under Cleopatra with what we know from her father's reign or the reign of Augustus? If so, why didn't you undertake it? Okay, that's not a fair question, but more importantly, do you think that a study of Cleopatra's Egypt, not a biography of Cleopatra, would actually have some kind of impact on a future biography of Cleopatra? So this is always the profound sort of philosophical question. When you write a biography, you get bogged down in details about a person and their way through life, whereas if you write the study of whatever the world in this important period of time, their actions may be important, but a lot of detail is not. And it's always a question between the biographers and between the people who think that they are serious historians. And the last question, of course, has to do with Caesarion. How do we separate fact from propaganda in the case of Caesarion? And who was the father? And is that a relevant question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much indeed to you, and indeed to your fellow panelists, to our panelists, for this wonderful set of reactions and comments. Livia, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you actually see me? Because
no, actually, I can see you for one.
Okay, I don't know what's happening because
now I can see an L, which is an improvement.
Okay, I've just okay. Thank you very. Now, can you see me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Okay, first of all, thank you very much indeed to all of you for such an attentive and precise and committed reading of my book. So I'm really grateful and I'm really honored to be here. First of all, just to clarify where this idea came from, I was asked to write a biography of Cleopatra by an editor, Laterza, for the wider audience. So there was quite a lot of negotiation during the writing of the book and when I actually tried to submit it, because initially they wanted me to write something much more, something that could be easily read by the larger public, etc. And from their point of view, from the point of view of the publishing house, it was even too full of sources, papyri, and inscriptions. So mainly, this is why I tried to rewrite the yet another biography of Cleopatra, and I feel slightly guilty about that. But certainly, I'm aware that there is room. I mean, while I was writing the book, I realized that there was room for at least other two books. One is the book Peter van Minnen was talking about, the book about Cleopatra's Egypt, or Cleopatra's era, time, as seen through the lens of the papyri, of course. But so this is still possible. This is a desideratum, so to speak. So I would really like to continue exploring that area in more sort of academic publications. And of course, the other possible book would be on the court of Cleopatra. Newcastle is a center where my former colleagues published a wonderful book on ancient courts. And I think that the court of Cleopatra would deserve closer attention, because as Micaela pointed out, there are quite a lot of shadowy or not so shadowy figures that we need to investigate further. So I'll try to answer a few questions of yours, but excuse my English, which has become even worse than when I was working with you. But to start from John's questions, and thank you very much, John, for your words on the Hellenistic Cleopatra. That was my first attempt. Let's try to write a biography of Cleopatra as a less exceptional figure. So my Italian colleagues were making fun of me, and they were saying, do you think that the publisher will accept a biography of a non-exceptional Cleopatra? So that's not going to work. But actually, yes, Cleopatra as a Hellenistic queen, I think it's very important to show that Cleopatra was part of a tradition, and in many ways, she's perfectly understandable in the context of Hellenistic kingship and in particular of Hellenistic queens. Her exceptionality perhaps is linked, in my view, and the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that part of her exceptionality is linked to her meeting with Julius Caesar, which shapes not only her reputation, but also the way she presented herself, the way she shaped her own memory. The diadema, yes, perhaps it would be interesting to look at this diadema as something which had much more importance than our sources show. I'm thinking of the famous scene of King Herod meeting Augustus at Samos, as depicted by Josephus, where Herod pulls out, he takes off the diadema when approaching Augustus. This was clearly an important gesture. Nicolaus of Damascus in Josephus recorded that. Perhaps that was something programmatic, something much different from what perhaps Cleopatra and her brother did when they were recognized as reges socii the first time in 46 in Rome, because the fact that Julius Caesar inscribed Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 14th as friendly kings, as reges socii, was something that wasn't perhaps very popular in Rome, and of course King Herod and Augustus needed to mark their own difference from that precedent. Other famous, the most famous diadema of all was, of course, the diadema of Alexander the Great, which was visible in Alexander's Soma or Sema in Alexandria. So I'm not sure that, of course, Caesar wanted to be a rex in the sense of Romulus rather than Alexander. So I think that the Macedonian kingship was at stake. Cleopatra was emphasizing her being the legitimate descendant of the Ptolemies. And these are her last words on her deathbed, as if she was trying to show that she was more legitimate than Augustus. Okay, I'm just trying to be quick, but I'm happy to go back to individual points if you want me to. Other questions? Micaela, well, yes, of course, I would like to translate my book, although I have already made some corrections to it, which I'm going to explain later. So probably I would need to rewrite some parts, but why not? I would be happy to translate it. As I said before, I was asked explicitly to write it for an Italian audience. And as concerns your question on women, yes, basically the book doesn't always provide answers to the questions. Actually, I'm sure it has raised more questions than it's been able to, clarify points. In particular, as concerns the relationship between Cleopatra and Livia, for example. Yes, you're right. While writing this book, I realized that sometimes earlier biographies of Cleopatra or books written for a larger audience were built on categories, on modern categories, which we all know that don't work for the ancient world. I make some examples, even in terms of relationships. Some people thought that, I read in an article by a colleague actually, that Mark Antony was probably jealous about the previous relationship of Cleopatra with Julius Caesar, but this doesn't work at all in our sources. It was in Antony's interest to stress that Julius Caesar was involved in a love affair with Cleopatra. So, for instance, that doesn't work. On the other hand, it wasn't a feminist world, of course. It was a patriarchal world. So I think it is likely that Livia could have had a channel of communication in some way with Cleopatra. We know that she had a sort of correspondence with Herod's sister Salome, for instance. They had slaves, often women or musicians, singers, people from their court who could work as go-betweens. But if Livia had any sort of secret or unofficial correspondence with Cleopatra, I'm sure that was instrumental for an anti-Octavia kind of policy. I mean, the real leader during Cleopatra's reign is not Livia, it was Octavia. And I found the recent studies on Octavia and Livia by some Italian colleagues of mine, such as Francesca Cenerini or Francesca Rohrer and other colleagues who are working on women, on Julio-Claudian women. I found their work illuminating because they helped to give more a three-dimensional kind of portrait of these women. They weren't all the same because they were all women. They weren't all in the same position, of course. So there were precise power dynamics. Unfortunately, there isn't enough evidence, and I've often been accused of being speculative, but I thought that this time I could dare to say, to make some wild suggestions, even if there isn't a hard evidence to prove actually a link, a correspondence between Cleopatra and Livia. But at least I hope to have shown that it is less improbable and less impossible than often assumed. To move on, the question of Cleopatra's self-presentation, or the presentation of Cleopatra as a polyglot. Well, I think that this is part of her own construction, of her own memory or presentation. She was probably very good at, we know that she was very good at manipulating and building her own image. And the idea of speaking many languages may come from, well, I think that it probably comes not so much from Mithridates, but from a Persian background. Again, you said that there is a wide range of sources, but while writing this book, I realized that I was still too focused on Greek and Roman sources, and I should know more about Parthian religion, about Persian background, because the idea of the king as someone who can speak all the languages of his subjects occurs in the Jewish tradition, and it is attributed to Mithridates. So again, this is probably a topos. I'm not destroying the idea of Cleopatra as an exceptional woman, but at the same time, I'm sure that this was part of her projected image as the future leader of the unified Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires. Finally, Peter, thank you very much for your first of all, for being here, and also for your words. And there is a lot of work to do on Cleopatra's Egypt. And you're right, I should have included more papyri, but I already almost, I waged war with some publishers to include all the sources that I did. As concerns the birth of Caesarion, I must say that I have something to add, because I have written an article after publishing the book, an article which is forthcoming, hopefully, in the next issue of Quaderni di Storia, and it is again in Italian, where I revised the evidence in a more attentive way and including more evidence. I revised the evidence in the context of the birth of Caesarion. And I thought in this article, I totally agree with what you have said today. I just summarize my new conclusions. And I thought that basically, first of all, the will of Julius Caesar. The will of Julius Caesar probably, we're pretty sure, never mentioned Caesarion. We have a passage in Nicolaus of Damascus where Nicolaus says that Julius Caesar declared Caesarion as a pseudos, a fake. Again, Nicolaus was writing under Augustus, so it was in the interest of Augustus to show that Caesarion was an illegitimate son of Julius Caesar. Papyrological evidence, Anaxyrhynchus papyrus shows that still as late as the end of July of 44, Cleopatra was still reigning with her brother, Ptolemy XIV. At the same time, we have the information in Cassius Dio that Dolabella, to thank Cleopatra for her help against Cassius, granted her to give the title of king to the little Caesarion. So now I think that it is more likely that Caesarion was born sometime in 44. There is obviously, there are some problems. We know from Suetonius that Caesar passus est, that he tolerated that she called her son after his name. But again, this could be fake news, as you suggest. In any case, I think that there is a sort of accumulation of evidence, including the Cyprus coinage and the Pompeii painting, showing a little Caesarion who is a baby, basically. Okay, they don't need to be realistic, but still, they show Cleopatra as Aphrodite and Caesarion as Eros or Cupid. He's very little, and he's already wearing a diadem. So I think that perhaps we have to kind of underline, to emphasize the information in Cassius Dio that links the events after the Ides of March, Cleopatra's help to Dolabella, and the beginning of the association of Cleopatra's son to the throne. So that could take, which more or less coincides with the appearance of the first inscriptions, hieroglyphic inscriptions, mentioning Caesarion, which date from 43 BCE. The first one dates from February 43. Of course, this lends some credit to Cicero's letter, and I think that perhaps I should have believed Cicero's words, and I should have read his words more attentively. Incidentally, I wanted to ask Peter a question on the official called the O pros tois procheirois, the sort of the official who was acting as a, let's say, prime minister, although it's an anachronism, of Cleopatra, perhaps the kind of office that Theon was having in the inscriptions you mentioned in 46 and 41. Well, in the letters of Cicero, we have the mention of a Hammonius. This Hammonius, we already know that there was one Hammonius as an agent of Ptolemy Auletes in Rome earlier on. But Cicero, I'm just recovering the, okay. Yes, Cicero defines Hammonius the sponsor promissorum. He's saying that basically he's looking back in anger at the times when Cleopatra was residing in Caesar's villa in Trastevere, and then he says that he's happy about Cleopatra's the fact that Cleopatra left Rome. I was wondering whether this sponsor promissorum couldn't be a Latin rendering of the O pros tois procheirois. In that, of course, in Cicero, there is a slight sarcasm, because it becomes like the guarantor of the promises. I mean, at least it sounds like that to an Italian ear, but basically there is I think, an echo in Cicero of the presence of this official, a very important official who's described as sponsor promissorum, and perhaps the procheirizzo could be compared at least to the Latin promitto, the one who, the chief of the executive, the one who kind of executes. I don't know how to translate that in English, but the one who looks after, takes care of the official decrees of the queen, even when she's absent or she's abroad. So again, looking in the letters of Cicero, I think that there could be perhaps a kernel of much more than previously assumed. Cicero talks about illo Caesare in that famous letter to Atticus, 1420. He says, I'm sorry about the abortion of Tertulla, and I wish that it would be true for about the queen, the Regina, and the illo Caesare. While writing my book, I assumed that if Cicero talked about that infamous Caesar, it meant that the baby was already there. But I'm not so sure now. perhaps Cicero, knew that Cleopatra, when Cleopatra went to Rome in 44, advertised, or at least said publicly, that the baby she was going to have, if a boy, would be called Caesar. And people were making noise about that, which would explain Nicolaus of Damascus' passage on the fact that there were rumors in 44 that Julius Caesar wanted to move his residence to Alexandria because of Cleopatra. I don't hope to provide an answer, the ultimate answer to the question, but I hope that at least it is clearer that the coins from Cyprus, the fresco from Pompeii, and Cassius Dio, the letters of Cicero, probably refer to the same events. The fact that Cleopatra didn't actually follow what Caesar had initially planned, that after the Ides of March, she moved on and followed her own personal strategy and plan. And she got rid of her brother and put on the throne herself and her son. I'm not sure I've responded to all your questions, but as concerns that inscription for the synagogue, granting asylum to a synagogue and ending with Regina et Rex, I personally think that would make sense if we identified the Regina and Rex with Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIV as Reges Soci, precisely around 46 or after the end of the Alexandrian War, when the Jews of Egypt were quite crucial for the victory of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. Again, that would leave a lot of room to write an article at least, or even more, on the relationship between Cleopatra and the Jews of Egypt, or the Jews in general. Some work has been done. There is a very good article by Sarah Pierce, who has rightly shown that Josephus and Nicolaus' portrait of Cleopatra as the enemy number one of the Jews is heavily influenced by Herod's propaganda, let's put it this way. So if we look at the policy of the Hellenistic queens, we can see that the relationship and their policy towards the Jewish communities in Egypt was much different. Again, well, thank you. I'm reading the chat and I say hello to all my former colleagues. Again, we have to be aware of looking at Cleopatra through not only modern categories, but also through the memory of Augustus or Herod or Nicolaus. I'm not saying that Cleopatra's self-presentation would be more truthful, but at least we must at least try to find it. Okay, so over to you, Federico, and I'm happy to go back to other points if you.
Thanks very much, Livia. Thank you very much. Well, I find it really well heartwarming that basically your research on Cleopatra is not at all over, and in many ways this biographical project is the springboard for plenty more to come, and that I think is in itself a very important point to take home from this. But quite apart from that, I know that there are already questions in the pipeline, and of course Peter might want to answer the question that you asked him earlier. Judy Hallett has a question, and then Jerry Patterson has one. Judy,
thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Well, I can.
Yes. All right. Nice it was a wonderful discussion, and I'd like to pick up on some points made by John and Micaela. First and foremost, that not coincidentally, the death of Cleopatra begins monarchy at Rome. And how is her image used in Augustan writers besides Virgil to signal the difficulties that monarchy brings, particularly the excessive control given to women who happen to be biologically related to the male monarchs. And I want to refer to this article, an essay that Karen Klaber-Hirsch and I have just published in the New Routledge companion to, I think it's called Women, Greek Women Monarchs or whatever. And in it, we look at, among other things, Horace's Cleopatra Ode, which is, of course, both critical and sympathetic toward Cleopatra, and how Livy evokes the very critical language of Horace in portraying the Etruscan queen Tullia as a negative model of what happens when he's writing, in the 20s. If Rome goes down the path of monarchy that the Etruscans personified, that the different Hellenistic kingdoms embody. And I wonder if you thought more about how Cleopatra's image is used ideologically and propagandistically about the dangers of giving women power in this kind of government, just in the Roman world.
Thank you so much. What do you think, Livia? Shall we take 2 or 3 questions and then you go for another?
Yeah.
Jerry, you had a question on Caesarion, and of course, plenty more has been said on Caesarion since.
Yes, in one sense it does, but the one bit of evidence is about 18 months or more ago. I was actually at Dendera in Egypt, looking at the great depiction of Cleopatra and Caesarion on there. And it raised the question in my mind as to what is the message that she's trying to get over, on the assumption that she's in part behind that message, about the role of Caesarion, which it may have nothing to do with her Rome as such, as it were. So that was really just an addition to the discussion you had on a Caesarion. If I could put it in a general context, I think John set up very well the way that we should be interested in the way that the Hellenistic world or Hellenistic thinking is taking over in Rome. I think you have to see Rome not as an outlier in the 1st century BC, but as actually part of the Hellenistic world, not least because it's part of the Hellenistic trade world, trade and economic world we see integrated. And that therefore there's no surprise to find whatever the diadem is about being tried on and thought, because these are ideas that Rome are thinking about at the time. It's a much more general thing. That was just an observation. But I was just interested in the Dendera stuff. But in particular, the tendency is to think about Caesarion as a Roman historian from the point of view, what's she trying to say about Rome? But in fact, it may not have nothing to do with that, with her image. So that was my question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you very much indeed. Are there other questions or comments from the audience, far and wide? Peter, I see you're raising your hand.
If I may, something
Yep.
About the prostois progeirois and the sponsor promissorum. I will certainly look into that later. The title that I plucked out of this other text, Ho epita pragmata kai epites polios apolele menos, like the other one, is also a new title for the period of Cleopatra. And I think they are all part of an innovated network that Cleopatra needed to allow her to behave somewhat differently from these other Hellenistic rulers, in that she was absent from Alexandria so often, from her center of power, and she needed to make sure through novel new offices that she stayed in touch and in control. And I think that that is different from earlier. Yes, these Hellenistic rulers or the Ptolemies would leave Alexandria to visit Egypt or to fight a war in Syria or something, but not for such long periods of time, doing international diplomatics, Cleopatra style. There is something novel going on that requires a set of offices and people. And I hope that if you ever get down to that book on the court of Cleopatra, that we will get more light on this sponsor promissorum and all the other officials and who they really are, because they are kind of anonymous figures. We have a name, but we don't really know their background. So that's a comment.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Other questions or comments? Roland, please.
Thank you for the presentation, Livia, and it's very, very interesting. It is just a question, really. You spoke about, the interest that there might lie, or the scope there might be for talking about courts or studying a court of Cleopatra, and it's not something I particularly thought about, but I mean, what would the personnel of it be identifiable as? There's a strange thing, isn't there, in Plutarch, where Antony is denounced by Octavian, and then he says, and we should really be going to take this war against Mardian and Pothinus and Iras, and so it's kind of eunuchs and women, and maybe non-Roman women. I don't know. Presumably, one rather salient aspect of court arrangements and so on in this court would be to do with Jews, and would it be to do partly with relations with the Herod as well? I mean, the attitude of or the role that the court played in accommodating Jews, I don't know. You'd know a lot more than me, I know.
Thank you. Thanks.
Perhaps one more question before we hand over to Livia for a... Well, if I can make one little comment followed by a quick question. There are several remarkable things about this book. And one of the things that struck me the most, I've got to say, is the iconographical section right in the middle, to which Livia constantly makes reference really throughout the book. And there are some rather arresting images, which I was only superficially familiar with, from Pompeii and Herculaneum, including one that really, Livia suggests it quite attractively, does really seem to, really does look like a portrait of Cleopatra, or like very similar, very closely comparable to the known portraits of Cleopatra. So I was wondering more generally whether Livia could say something more about the traces of Cleopatra's presence, or indeed legacy, in Pompeii or indeed in Campania?
Exactly. Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. I'll try to respond to your questions. To the first question about the image of Cleopatra in Latin literature, or the reputation of Cleopatra. Well, this is something which has been addressed by a series of studies, of excellent studies. So I thought that it wouldn't be a good idea to focus on that too much, because of course Horace, Perpetuus and Virgil, I mean, especially for an Italian audience, are all quite, well, not familiar, but so I'm sure that, I mean, we know that the image of Cleopatra as you know, the Eastern queen, the public enemy number one, of course, deeply affected the creation of the image of Augustus. Of course, the war was declared against Cleopatra, not against Antony, and it was an ideological. There was surely also an ideological clash between the image of the Ptolemaic queen, a queen who was also a goddess, and the image of the goddess Isis with her divine son Horus, and the Roman background, of course, which was profoundly different. And we can see that. We can see that in the follow-up, because I mean, if you think about, I'm just making one example on the fate of Augustus's own daughter, Julia. Well, that speaks quite effectively about the attitude of the new princeps. Even later emperors, the emperors who were more into Egypt, the emperors who favorably utilized gods like Serapis, for instance. I'm thinking about Vespasian, I'm thinking about Roman emperors who actively used for political purposes, Serapis. Well, they seem to cut off Isis from their own world. So it was a definitely more sort of patriarchal attitude than Cleopatra's. Okay, to go, which links to Jerry's question about the meaning of the relief of Cleopatra and Caesarion. You're right, I also had the clear sensation, the clear feeling that it is wrong to approach Cleopatra and Caesarion only from the Western point of view, from the Greek-Roman point of view. Caesarion was an Egyptian god, the divine son of Isis. And this applied not only to Egyptian religion, but also to Ethiopian religions, where there was also a queen mother with a divine son, or to Near Eastern cities where, of course, there were various declinations, various kind of manifestations of the female goddess Ishtar, Astarte, etc. So, of course, on the walls of the temple of Dendera, Cleopatra was talking to the Egyptian audience. So I'm sure we would need to investigate more in the pharaonic precedents and in the Egyptian religion. Again, I know that not being an Egyptologist, I struggled to include some Egyptological evidence, but not all of it, and not perhaps in in the most efficient, effective way. But this is important also to, I think the issue of a Caesarion as an Egyptian god is important because we need to understand how the Egyptian population accepted the murder of Caesarion in 30 BCE. And I think that Octavian's reference, I'm sure that Octavian, then Augustus, of course, explored and explained this in his autobiography. The passages we have left in Cassius Dio and in Suetonius, where Augustus, in the Gymnasium of Alexandria in 30 BCE, says that he has forgiven the Alexandrian people because, thanks to the intercession of Arius, but also to, out of respect for Serapis and for Alexander the Great. I think they should be reread in a more sort of attentive way, in that I think that there is the explanation is somewhere there. In 30 BCE, Arius played a role probably in the temple of Serapis, which was the temple where new rulers were legitimized. And Alexander, the cult of Alexander the Great played a role. So there must have been, and Arius is the same person who allegedly suggested that Caesarion should be killed, because ukekton poly Caesarie. It is not good that there are too many Caesars. This seems a joke, but probably isn't. So we must think of some very precise ways, some very precise ceremonial ways, Egyptian ways in the Temple of Serapis, where Augustus, through Arius, through the agency of powerful Alexandrians, was in some way legitimized and got some sort of legitimization. Not an easy one, because we know that the situation wasn't at all pacified in the first years after the Roman conquest. But so yes, we have to look at Egyptian religion, Parthian religion, and Ethiopian religion as religions where there is also always a sort of queen, divine mother with a divine son, who has some sort of relationship as the avenger of the dead father. I move on to the next question. I'm not sure. Yes, Peter's question about the court and new titles. Yes, I think that we should look at the creation of a new court, perhaps. In this way, Cleopatra could be exceptional. We are left with partial descriptions of the donation of Alexandria, the donations of Antioch, what happens later. I think that the alleged, the sort of the conquest or the dream of restoring the glory days of the Ptolemaic Empire as an empire stretching as far as the Parthian Empire, made it necessary for Cleopatra to create a larger court, including probably Jewish. Well, we know that there were some women, some men who acted as go-between between Alexandria and the Jews, but also the Parthian court. In 30 BCE, when Octavian entered the royal palace in Alexandria, we know that it was full of foreign princes and princesses who were living there as something between hostages and guests. So there was a new and cosmopolitan court in Alexandria in Cleopatra's time. And unfortunately, as you all noticed, sometimes we also only have some names. In the last chapters of Plutarch's Life of Antony, for instance, there is a Seleucus. Who was this Seleucus? And even the two female slaves of Cleopatra, the Eiras and Charmion, the hairdresser and the other servant. I mean, Eiras could be Irene, could be a Jewish name. That's at least Heinz Heinen's idea. So there is still some work to do, although the sources are not too generous in that respect. And finally, yeah, as concerns the, personally, I don't think that Nicolaus of Damascus was at Cleopatra's court, and I say that in the book. I think that he was the teacher of her children once Antony and Cleopatra were already dead. So he was on the side of Octavia, not on Cleopatra's side, because otherwise he wouldn't have written these things on her. And on the iconography of Cleopatra, on the impact of her image in Italy, and in particular in Campania, well, we know that in Campania there was a very strong influence of the Egyptian religion, just not only for commercial reasons, Puteoli, but also Herculaneum were places where there were very important temples to Isis. I'm sure, and Palestrina, Praeneste, of course. I'm sure that there was an impact there. We know there was a continuing sort of worship of Cleopatra in Egypt, in some Egyptian temples, and up to the 4th century. And there might be many more portraits of Cleopatra disguised as Isis, which we don't know, or which haven't been studied yet. I haven't surveyed all the iconographical evidence, of course. It is clear that she left a very important mark, which was in some way reused by the printers, by Augustus, in not in the very first years after the conquest, perhaps, but in the latter part of his principate. And of course, that's clear if we think about the obelisks, which were taken to Rome around 12 and 11 BCE. And I also think that his role as Pontifex Maximus played a role, had an impact on the ways, the new ways he started to approach Egypt, the solar cult, etc., without any references to Cleopatra, of course, but still using the same tools, ideological tools and iconographical tools that had been of Cleopatra. Not least because he also, like Cleopatra, wanted to conquer the Parthian Empire. So the aims, the political aims were more or less the same. Of course, there have been numerous studies on, for instance, the similarities or possible parallels between, let's say, the Arapakis and the Egyptian temples or the Egyptian kiosks etc. There are some good studies about the imperial cult chapels in Egyptian temples. I'm thinking about Stefan Pfeiffer's studies. So it is a fertile field, and again, there is more room for thought, of course. I'm sorry not to be completely satisfactory or exhaustive.
No. It's extremely satisfactory. It's extremely satisfactory. Livia, thank you so much. Thank you so much for, first of all, for writing this book, and also for engaging with the question and comments and reactions of of our panelists this evening, and indeed of the audience. I'm very grateful to Peter, to John, and to Micaela for making this possible, for taking part, and for discussing Livia's work. And indeed, warm thanks to all of you who have tuned in. I was about to say turned up, but tuned in is the correct way forward. Many thanks to Anke and Joe for setting up the event, and we will be reconvening on the classics, on the Newcastle Classics and Ancient History Research Seminar Series next week, won't we, Anke and Joe? Yes, next Wednesday, 4 p.m. And until then, many thanks to you all. Again, many thanks to Livia, and have a very nice evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Livia.
Thank you, Livia. Bye. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Livia.
Bye.
Great.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Ciao.
Ciao.